your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Atheist Manifesto. From Answer Media, this is the Atheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined once again by my co-host, Ari Stillman. What is up, Ari?
I am deep in thought. I have been pondering an ethical quandary as of late.
Oh, God.
Posited by a Jeremiah Traeger. So, you've probably heard of the trolley problem, right? It's pretty popular. Like, it's that thing where there's a train coming down the tracks, and you can either let it go on the track that it's continuing to go on and it's going to run over 5 people, or you can flip a switch and it'll change tracks and it'll run over 1 person.
Right, I'm familiar.
You know, and there's different ways to answer that. So Jeremiah came up with a similar type of problem on, I guess this was on Saturday night? No, it was Friday night. So if you had magical blowjob capabilities and you could turn anyone you give a blowjob to from evil to good, would you suck Donald Trump's dick? And we found that there are two camps of people. There's the camp, which is the camp I'm in, that says, I would hate it, but I would do it for the sake of humanity. And other people that said, no, screw humanity, I'm never doing it.
Yeah, wow, that's really hard. Man, I don't know.
Celeste said absolutely not, just so you know.
That's good. And to be honest, knowing her, that's the answer I would expect. And that's, I can appreciate that. Tell you what, I will ponder this. Listeners, email the atheistmanifesto@gmail.com with your answers, and we may or may not play your answers on the next episode of the show. How's that sound?
We may or may not randomly select someone to receive a prize. I'm going to go with may not, but it also could happen, you know.
Right.
I could send you this paperclip I have here on the table straight from Normal, Illinois, Ari's paperclip.
Yeah, like I've got a guitar pick. I'd be willing to throw that in. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Because
we'll
you've
see what
touched
happens.
it.
Yeah. So
right.
It was an amazing weekend this past weekend. You can probably hear it in my voice still. And I got engaged, right? Celeste and I are engaged. I did the thing right after my talk. After the Q&A, I pulled out a ring and I proposed to Celeste in front of the hundreds of people that were in the room, and it was amazing. I've been planning the whole thing for over a year with the help of Gene and the organizers of the con and some really, really, really special people. And to top it all off, Shelly was there and she agreed to serenade us after my proposal with her song Gratitude, which, if anybody's ever heard me gush, is like one of my favorite songs ever. And
I've had that song stuck in my head all day because of this.
You're welcome.
It's a good song. I'm not complaining.
No, right. That's fine. I know you're not here to hear me gush. You're here for a podcast, right? So let's do the podcast. So,
whatever.
We have an episode in 2 parts for you this week. Later on the show, you're going to hear my talk from the con. But first, a story. It never fails when I go to cons, I meet some really amazing people with some really amazing stories to tell. And this past weekend, of course, wasn't any different. I try to talk to as many people as I can because, one, like, I just love talking to and meeting people, right? It's what I do. It's something I really enjoy, and it's a big part of the reason that I do all of this in the first place. But the other reason is because it never fails that I find someone with a story to tell that I think other people need to hear. And Nate's story is one of those. I should mention here before we jump in, Nate's story involves emotional and psychological abuse of the religious kind. If that's something you'd rather not engage with, fast forward to about 45 minutes into the episode and head straight to my talk from ReasonCon.
I remember what life was like before my parents started going off the deep end. I remember life where I had friends over. I remember life where my mom babysitted for people, where we went to your normal average church, which, you know, in Kentucky it's a given. And I remember having friends. I remember feeling like a normal kid. And then I remember the day that started to change. And that day was right after my third oldest sibling was born. I'm the oldest of 6. And I just remember the look on my dad's face is really all that I remember. My dad went on, decided he wanted to become a pastor. He decided he wanted to become a preacher. He went to seminary, decided everything he learned at seminary was crap, and then became preacher of a church out in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky. Unlike, I think, most people that I've heard tell their stories about growing up in a cult-type environment, they don't remember, most of the time there was somebody there that was orchestrating. You're part of a group in which there's a head that's trying to make stuff happen. There's the David Koresh of a group of people who've been tricked. In my case, I watched my dad turn into that type of person. I watched my dad go from just an average, me as an atheist, I would consider his beliefs to be, any form of religion to be off, kind of the deep end for me. But I watched him go from a mainstream view of the world and of Christianity in general to a gradually more and more and more, a design of his own construction, in which he viewed everything from a woman's place in the world to what was good and bad through a completely different lens than anybody else I encountered. Even later in life, when he started trying to gather people around him, a typical cult initiation, the difference was he wasn't able to hold it together. I remember first thing to go was television, because that was an influence that they couldn't filter. The most important thing to them was control of information. For example, when television went away, videos didn't go away, just certain types of videos went away. I couldn't sit down and watch Barney or, as a 5-year-old I was probably about 5.5, 6 years old when television went away, but I couldn't sit down and watch that or watch Batman or Spider-Man or whatever was on TV because they couldn't check it first. But I could totally watch, whatever the Institute of Creation Research put out, that month for whoever brain dead people bought it. I want to say that my dad's real, conversion over to that type of thinking started around 98. And they caught on to this group. Its name was Vision Forum, was the name of the actual company, started by this guy named Doug Phillips, who turns out later was a pederast and just all kinds of nastiness. But at the time, nobody knew anything. My parents reacted weirdly with each other. A normal person, a normal couple, one person calls the other one on their bullshit. Somebody gets to be a little too full of themselves. The other one goes, really? Fucking really? Like, seriously? I listen to you when you go to the bathroom. You shit like everybody else. It's just normal, normal couple stuff. And I watched the crazy bounce between the two of them, in which my dad would decide that something was true. And then my mother made sure that he never went back on that. So my dad would listen to this guy who was the most illogical, he was a great orator. He could tell a story like very few people I've met in my life. He'd been trained on how to bring people over to his side through I won't say a solid argument, but through a well-written argument. So my dad would, I guess for him, make the mistake of stating that he agreed with that. And then my mother would make sure he never went back on it. So it's like, someone's edging forwards and they can't go back. A normal person leans, a normal person has a pendulum of opinion. They swing one direction and then there's a reaction and it goes back the other way. And hopefully, eventually they find equilibrium. There was never an opportunity for it to swing back. I think, I don't know, but I think this is probably what pushes most people towards this, is a normal person has a swing, an ebb and a flow to their growth as a person. And when someone's there to stop the ebb is when they go off the deep end. What happened after my dad stopped pastoring the church because he realized that the people there were not going to do everything that he said was he kind of imploded a little bit. He cut his circle. And it was just his family, which he spent a large portion of his time trying to grow in any possible way that he could, which is why I have 5 siblings today. But what happened next was he bought a farm on the end of a dead-end road. You could walk outside and scream at the top of your lungs and no one would even know that you did. which is scary when you say it like that. But at the time, I was probably 8 years old, and I had no idea how weird, going out and looking for a place like that was. I mean, it was unusual, and it continued. It was like a fungus growing in his mind. Anyone in an argument with him that knew his stated opinions could manipulate him into agreeing to nearly anything.
Oh, wow.
So while he was the person trying to coalesce a group, it was always possible for someone to engage him in an argument, and once they learned to know him well enough, could manipulate him into a corner that he couldn't get out of. What he did was, after he got his farm and started building his house, he started guest speaking at churches. And what he found was that his sweet spot was as a provocateur. He would go in and he would tell a sermon that was just so incredibly outrageous, yet completely based on scripture that he could point out to you, and that someone that didn't have a significant enough understanding couldn't, refute, because the verse says right there, it says woman ain't supposed to wear men's clothes. He gained a level of notoriety in a very hyper-local community by going around and making people angry, to a point where he finally found a church that was desperate enough for members that the level of antagonism that he brought to it was appealing to them.
So it was 90s clickbait.
Yeah. Yeah. In possibly the worst sense of the term, he was a form of clickbait for churches. So at the time that he started there, the church had, I think, 6 members. And he grew the church. I mean, I won't say exponentially necessarily, because it was a form of explosive growth and then collapse when everybody realized he was full of shit. Explosive growth, collapse. He had the Koresh ability to bring people to him, but he did not have the true cultist ability to hold people to his way of thinking.
So as this was happening, as he was sort of building his reputation and building this church, what were things like at home during this point? Like, were things changing at home as rapidly as they were changing on the outside as he was gaining this notoriety? And
it changed rapidly and then completely stopped. The closest way I can describe the way life was at home was just a special version of hell, specially crafted for my own particular psyche to be completely miserable in.
Can you expand on that?
For my father, at the entire time he was a pastor, he worked. And as I tell this story, I want to be clear. He absolutely believed everything he said. I watched him go through crises of faith that I've never seen in anyone since, even Christians that I have confronted and caused them to question their own opinions and preconceived notions. I've never seen anyone go through the level of discomfort, the level of self-doubt that I saw him suffer under. But what I did see is at home, and this is where I'm going to tie back into the Vision Forum crowd, they promoted philosophy while they didn't use the term. As I recall, it was called quiverful. The concept of quiverful is basically that you have children as forced labor for the parents. They're there so that the dad doesn't have to go do something. You can say, I'm just going to send kids to do this. Except he didn't send anyone to do anything, because that would allow us to be influenced by people outside of his control. So instead, he would decide that he wanted to do something, whether he went through a spell where he wanted to raise rabbits, which involved yours truly raising probably between 500 and 700 rabbits entirely on their own at the age of 10. When it came to stuff at home, he would go through fads in the same way that, about as fast as people come up with dieting fads today. I mean, just the new thing of the week, whether it was goats or cows or chickens. I still cannot stand chickens to this day due to my experiences. But at home life was pretty unusual, I think, and that most stories that I've heard never involved just a level of aloneness that I think mine did. My dad worked my dad was always self-employed pretty much my entire childhood. And I always would get excited in the times that I would get to go work with him because he was a distributor. So he would sell things to Walmart and he would go around to like different stores and stock shelves and stuff. I was always excited because it meant I got to see people. I was never allowed out of his sight, but I got to actually, say hi to people at some level. He would leave the house at about between midnight and 2 a.m. and he would get home at around 10 or 11 in the morning, to sometimes lunchtime, and then he would instantly go to sleep. And my mother would get up at about 9 o'clock in the morning and would leave at about 10:30 to 11 and wouldn't come back to about 4 in the afternoon. And I had 5 siblings. Well, it gradually increased, but at the end I had 5 siblings, which involved feeding them, making sure they were dressed, educating them because we were all homeschooled. So I taught 2 of my younger siblings to read, help, handled most of it, and also handled the running of the farm. My sister actually caught the next oldest. I honestly think my workload was probably a little worse, but she caught by far the worst end of the stick, in that she like me had vague memories of what life was like before, but the level of hell that girl went through, she still has one of the worst cases of, it's not PTSD. It's there's an extra letter attached to it, and it's when a continuous child CPTSD.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure I have that a little bit, but I've never seen a case as bad as she has, and to this day, like the stigma attached to it. I tried.
What was different about her experience that made it worse?
Well, I had outside responsibilities, which meant that on top of, basically raising 3 of my younger 5 siblings, literally from the time they quit breastfeeding, I fed them, changed their diapers, put them to sleep, woke them up, and all of it. But I had away time. I would go outside and go through that special hell that was trying to run that place at 10, not knowing what I was doing. She was trapped in the house, and as a woman was specially restricted in what she was told her value was. She's always been the type of person that when you told her that she couldn't do something, she would smile in your face and then go fucking do it and tell you to kiss her ass and laugh her ass off because you're sitting there looking stupid because you told her you couldn't do it. She couldn't do it. I've never seen such a consistent campaign of trying to just beat the crap of that out of somebody as I saw her go through. Just screaming punishment, telling her that she was never supposed to do what boys did, that she was not the same. They would always carefully step around saying that she wasn't as good as, but it was clearly implied in what they said. Just the conversation, I have begged her to go see somebody, but she still won't because of the stigma attached to that from the way she was raised. It's just not something that she was taught was something that people did. It sucks, but I don't know how to change her mind on it. She's going to be dealing with this for decades.
So, what were the consequences when things went wrong? Like, if you messed up and, whatever duties you had, or sneak in, like watching TV, that kind of stuff. Like, what were those consequences?
Me personally, I was the good kid. I was the obnoxious kid that got pantsed and his head got dunked in the toilet, in school. I never got to go to school, but that would have totally been me. I tried so fucking hard. I tried so hard to make them happy and never could. She didn't give a fuck, which is part of why her experience was so much worse than mine. I learned how to steer clear of the problems that were associated with not doing what you were what your expectations were of you. She never did because she didn't care. She wanted to live the life the way she wanted to. And she was going to be damned if she wasn't as good as any boy that she met, period, for her entire life. That's been literally her entire life. Even as an adult now that she finally got out, that is still her motto. She will do it. If somebody tells her that there's never been a boy that did that particular, she just does it. She just goes and does it. Anyway, as time went on, he got his farm, he got his house, he started doing whatever his newest fad was, and then he found a church that wanted him. and he started pulling people in. And it was part of the Reformed Baptist movement, is what he advertised. And he really, while theologically he identified with them, he had, I don't know, it's like the difference between a polygamous Mormon and a non-polygamous Mormon. They both believe that technically they're allowed to be polygamous. One of them just admits to the reality, and the other one says, "Oh no, this goes farther." That was kind of his. He went way farther than even the Reformed Baptist movement went. So he had a cycle in which he would pull in. He would get church membership up to 250 people, which was a lot for a church that had 3 people. And then everybody would see through it and go, "Holy shit, this guy's crazy," and they'd take off.
Was there like a defining event? Like, it was like he would eventually go too far? Or?
Well, he was continuing down a path. I mean, it was more of he would pull people in that were okay with this point that he was, and in this path he was going, and then they would go, "Whoa," and then because he would take another step, and then they would back off, and then another group of people that were gullible and were ready for this point that he was at would come in, and then he would keep going, and he never figured out how to get people to make the transition between one stage of insanity to another. Or I don't know if I would call it insanity, more of a one stage of just I don't really know, just craziness, just that he could never figure out how to move them farther. And I remember when a group of people decided they were going to take control of the church away from him and kick him out. And I remember his reaction to that. See, it's something that I'm trying to carry with me, but I find it slipping sometimes. Is the remembrance that 9 times out of 10, when you look at a situation in which you go, "That's just a despicable action," when you look at someone who's done something that's just so far outside of what's okay, we often forget that they're the hero of their stories. And their minds, they are completely justified in being where they're at. They have a completely logical succession of events that took them from being no different than me and you to being the crazy guy that ran off with a kid to California and just got caught last week. I mean, I don't know if you heard that story, but they're all the hero of their own story. I don't think I've ever seen a more clear example of that than with my father. So I remember the day that someone in the church called him. At the time, I think he was at 325 people there. And he had, I think, 3 loyal families that were just still completely sold. Somebody called him and said that they had received a call from somebody saying that they were holding an emergency session and were going to vote him out. I was present when my dad called them back and said, "Look, if that's how they feel, just have them vote me out. I don't want to be the pastor here if they don't want me." And these people said, No. We completely believe in what you're saying. We want to fight for you to stay here. And so I watched the level. It was probably 6 months to a year of my dad just completely questioning everything. And I so wish that I had been an adult at that time with my level of knowledge about both the Bible and other ways of thinking about the world. Because I think that if there was ever a time in my dad's life he was reachable with reason, it would have been that time. Because
getting kicked out of that church caused a crisis of faith.
See, he was never kicked out.
Oh,
the simple suggestion that this many people that he had spent a year and a half telling them his every private opinion and thought had just completely rejected his way of looking at the world just caused such a crisis of faith. I've never seen that, and I've heard people tell stories about it, but I've never heard anyone to the point that he was at. He was at such a level that I swear if there had just been a reasonable person there. But see, the problem is that when you view the world as if you were on a desert island, there's no one to talk to. He didn't have close friends. The church that he was part of continued to do the growth and shrink thing, with maybe one family that carried over between each. I mean, of the people that stood and kept him as pastor, 2 of the 3 were gone within the year. The one that was left were gone within 2 years. He ended up closing the entire church and going back to just being on his farm. He tried to go to a couple churches, got angry because of something my mother told him. Again, it's always her that it felt like was, pulling the strings, just, it only takes a nudge with someone like that. It only takes a nudge to keep them just going in that direction. And she was always the person there to give the nudge. Again, if he had just had someone that he respected that could have said something to him, I think even then maybe he could have pulled out. At 16, I got the probably single luckiest break of my entire life. When my dad closed down the church, he completely retired. He never accepted payment whatsoever from the church while or if he did, it was such an insignificant amount as to be negligible. So when the church was shut down, I think there were 2 families left, and they voted to basically cut him a check. Since he'd been running the church for like 3 years with, I would say, losing money, probably with the gas going back and forth. So he took that and he went back to the farm that he had paid off and decided that he was going to try and make it just on the farm. And he had yet another crisis, I won't say of faith, but of confidence, in which he saw the way my mother was. He had no idea that my mother was leaving every day and had nothing to do with the daily life of the kids, that I was the one doing everything. And he got there and realized that she wasn't getting out of bed till 9 or 10 in the morning. She was getting up, taking a shower, sitting in front of the computer that no one else but her was allowed to use, and then leaving. And he lost it. He freaked out because that was something that was a concrete part of his life, and that was something that he had no idea of. It had been 15 years, and he had no idea that it was like that. Somehow, she worked him out of it, and as manipulators tend to do. He spent about 2 years at home. And the luckiest break of my life happened, in which he decided to go back to work. And I told him at 16 or 15, nearly 16, I said, if you're going back to work, you need to take me with you. And for some reason he did. I don't know why. It should not have happened. Like I said, single luckiest day of my life is when he decided, as for some crazy reason, poor choice on his part, but he decided to bring me to work with him as a daily thing. So I started working full time at 16. I had essentially finished all the education I was going to receive at home by the time I was about 13 and a half or 14, and just didn't have time between raising kids and trying to teach them how to read. So at that point, that's just what I did. Went to work. It took me about 6 months to learn how to say good morning to people on my way by. I had no social skills whatsoever. The only people I'd ever met had been in church, and I had the worst, the worst experience with kids my own age at church. I had no idea how to deal with people. I was a spoiled brat at 6 years old. And never really left that mindset as a kid, because I never had kids to, stuff my head in a toilet and give me a swirly when I made some smart ass comment that was ridiculous. I never had anybody around me to teach me how to be around people. It was the hardest part about getting out, was honestly learning how to deal with people, learning how to form relationships, how to have a basic conversation.
Well, tell me about getting out. So you said getting out. That was it. So, you'd said that your dad taking you to work was the lucky. I mean, was that the thing that was like? So I know the outside world exists now, so that hold is breaking. Like, how did that process happen? The
mistake was less of meeting people, because if you are controlling their information, you can convince someone of anything. So he had me completely convinced that the majority of the people I met in the world were just crazy wackos that didn't know anything and were uneducated, and I had far higher an esteem of my own personal intelligence than I have today, for certain. But the mistake was that I had the ability to earn money. Even to the point that he was at, he still felt like, as a 16-year-old working full time, I deserved to earn some kind of money. That was where he messed up. Because suddenly, with an ability to earn income, I could go out and at the age of 2 years later, at the age of 18, or well, really 17, when I went out and got my first smartphone, suddenly his ability to filter what I could ingest informationally was gone at 17, and then especially at 18, at the point that, from the time I was 12 or 13, he would always hold up, well, at 18, you get to make your own decisions, until I got to be about 17 and a half, when he suddenly rethought that stance significantly and decided that suddenly I wasn't ready for that. But I was able to hold that up as, not really a shield. He was very, very serious about intellectual honesty. So if he said something, if he gave me a promise, it was very important to him that he kept that. So suddenly at 18 and a half, I could go out and buy a laptop. I could go out, and so long as I didn't flaunt it, as long as I didn't, show him that I was watching Star Wars for the first time at 18 and a half, which was the single greatest experience of my life. Holy shit. I had to go to Wikipedia just to figure out how to watch it, because I was so confused, because everybody was saying you're not supposed to watch the first three, 1, 2, and 3. And I was so confused because it made no sense. Anyway, I'm getting off track here, but that was amazing. But things like that, they were little chinks. I mean, all it took was a nudge. I had always read. My entire curriculum as a kid was like 4 math books and a list of 350 books to read. That was my curriculum. Do this and you're done with school. Sounds easy, not in practice, but I read a lot of books. I was the most racist 17-year-old you probably would have ever met, because everything I read was written between 1360 and like 1920. So a significant portion of the books I read were narratives of 1860 through 67. From the side that we're not going to talk about, but which you still see flags in this part of the country, ironically. I was always voraciously bringing in all the information I could, but it was like a starving person eating empty calories. And, eating something that didn't give them anything. My parents would read, or my mother, because my mother was the reader, would read every book that I read before I read it, and would have a black permanent marker that she would go through and mark through things that she didn't want me to know about. And it was always even the most innocuous books, like something that is today, I don't think most kids would even think about reading, but like the Boxcar Children. That was a big book in like the 60s and 70s and 80s. She had an entire book that she just took off the shelf because it mentioned the Big Bang Theory. Their one major mistake on our availability of information, while every novel was read through first, every book about science or anything else had to be gone through first to make sure there was no evidence or no reference to evolution or anything that pertains to real science. They messed up, and they had an entire shelf of encyclopedias. And I remember the day I found out how penises work. That was a cool day. For some reason, and I don't know why, they had never thought to go through the encyclopedias and make sure there weren't things they didn't want me to know about in them. So,
and did they see this transformation happening in you?
Absolutely not,
okay.
Because the transformation didn't really happen until I was about 18. Mm-hmm. These were all just little, things that I would like. I was pretty sure that sex involved belly buttons somehow, but I wasn't really sure because the Bible talks about navels, and I was like really confused. And then this one day at 14, I woke up. I'm walking through the library. There's this room that's just completely full of books, all of them filtered, and I go, I'll bet the S Encyclopedia has something about this. I've never felt so dirty in my entire life. And I went over there and I opened it up and I went to it. I went, oh, that's gross. And I put it back on the shelf and that was it. But I felt nasty for like probably about a year. And anyway, later in life, at 18, I say later in life, like 4 years later, at 18, I started going through being able to, download books on the internet. And I don't know if you ever, when smartphones first started to get big, Wattpad was a big thing. I loved Wattpad because every book was there, illegally, I might add, but people were uploading them, and it was awesome. And I was downloading them to my phone. And see, when I first got a smartphone, they didn't know, because my parents are very technologically illiterate, or were more so at the time than they are now, did not really understand what I could do with a phone. So I was sitting here reading just the coolest books. And for me, at 18, with the brain of a 12-year-old, the coolest books. Animorphs were amazing. And went through and just started just ingesting information and just could not stop, because there was so many things that I just never encountered before. So many things I didn't know that I felt like I really should have known. And at about 18 and a half, I started realizing that something wasn't right. Some things weren't matching up the way they had a week ago. Some things didn't make sense compared to facts. I started to learn what facts were, which was a big deal. And then since I've been always taught the concept of intellectual honesty, just with a restricted selection of information, I've never had a problem as an adult changing my opinions to match new information. When you stop controlling the flow of information, then that starts to go in the direction of fact instead of the fiction that you were raised with. So at about 18 and a half, I realized I should probably be thinking about getting out. So I went and got a driver's license. Didn't have a high school diploma because I was homeschooled, even though homeschoolers can technically get a high school diploma. But it was this weird manipulative thing where I wasn't given enough time to do all the school that they wanted me to do, and yet at the same time was blamed for not doing the things they wanted me to do. So I went out and got a GED. Ace that motherfucker, and started thinking about getting a job. And I remember the day that my grandmother, who was extremely, obscenely religious, thinks my parents are just terrible, terrible cultists that kept us away from her throughout most of our childhood. Like, I remember when sleepovers at grandma's house stopped, which was right around the same time that all the other crazy stuff started happening. She started seeing, that I had an interest. I started learning things and knowing about things, when we'd have conversations. And after I got my driver's license, which she encouraged me to get, I started stopping by her house, every time I had the opportunity, because she didn't live far away. She just was too far away for any of us to get to because, nobody had driver's licenses or, any way to get there, living in the middle of nowhere. So, and she encouraged me to get a GED, because she said that what was going on wasn't healthy and I needed to do what I thought was right. And what I thought was right was to get the hell away. So she encouraged me to get a GED, did well on it, went out and got a job. Sucked ass at the job, but I made money, and I moved out and got an apartment and met the woman who's now my wife and got along. I mean, I did well and really had a pretty peaceful separation. I had to completely cut ties for about a year because I didn't know what saying no was. And so I had to learn how to have a backbone. That took, well, I'm still working on it, but it took at least a year for me to get to the point where when they said something, I didn't have to do it. It was really hard, but I left on good terms because I was a boy. Boys are allowed to go out and do shit and, have jobs and, because boys are people unlike women.
And what's your relationship like with your parents now?
I mended fences to the point where we're on speaking terms and I could go over there, but I can't let them into my life in a significant amount because every time I tried to as an adult, they found a way to, I don't want to say screw me over, but screw me over. I mean, it's always been a way for them to reestablish control. It's always felt like that anyway. Maybe that's not completely, I don't know what's going on in their minds, but I know for me, it always felt like it was a way for them to try and reestablish control. So it's always had to be, I've always tried to mend a bridge and then had to pull back and cut something off because it was growing in the wrong direction. It goes along okay now. I've got a feeling next time I see my parents face to face, it's not going to be pretty because my sister and my parents had a falling out, and I had to sit through about 15 minutes of my mom talking shit about my sister and didn't say anything because I wanted to say it face to face. I get along far better with them when they're not in my life in any way outside of just asking me when they have IT advice, because that's what I do. And I don't know what's going to happen with my siblings, and it breaks my heart because they're there. They don't remember what life. I remember what life was like. My sister, not a lot, but she remembers a little bit of what life was like before. And since she and I grew up really, really close, even the experiences that she doesn't remember, they're still shared experiences because we related everything as a kid. None of the rest of them have that, and I don't know what's going to happen. But, what makes me mad about the entire situation is that none of this would have been remotely possible if it wasn't the way Kentucky's homeschooling laws were. None of it would have been possible. In Kentucky, you can just decide you're not going to school your kids. And if you tell the state that you're homeschooling, they won't ever call you again. You will never receive any form of contact from anyone whatsoever. If you just woke up one morning, I say, okay, I'm going to keep my kids at home and do terrible things to them. And I actually, at one point when my sister moved out, I kind of made the same argument to my dad. I said, listen, forget every thing. I didn't say ridiculous thing, but I thought thing that you believe. I said, let's say that my mom had been some kind of sex abuser. You set up the perfect environment for her to do whatever. She wasn't, just for the record, but she set up the perfect environment for that to have been possible. And in most states, that's simply not a thing that could have happened, because even in most states, homeschoolers are required to pass tests. They're required to at least be interviewed at some point, to make sure that they're okay. A kid just died just a few months ago because their parent, he had muscular dystrophy, and the caregivers, I think it was his caregivers just left him on a bed because, and pulled him out of school, and nobody ever even thought to check, because it's legal in Kentucky, because it's Kentucky apparently. If at any point a CPS worker had come to my house as a kid, it would have stopped. It wasn't bad enough for us to be taken away, but the CPS worker would have looked at them and said, okay, you have to at least provide them with a basic level of education. You have to at least give them this much. And then they would have freaked out. My parents would have freaked out because even with all his wackiness, when push comes to shove, if it's a question of him going to jail, he would have conformed, because he always did at every other point in my life. When push came to shove, he conformed. But there was never any form of accountability, which means that anybody who wants to keep their kids as sex slaves at home can totally do that with no consequences whatsoever, and no one would ever know. Anything they wanted to do, any fucked up thing they wanted to do, they could just do. And it pisses me off, and I wish I could do something about it, and I don't know what I can do about it outside of bitch and yell and write state senators about it. I do podcast interviews. But I'm hoping that someday, I know someday that stuff will change. I just hope it happens before more kids die.
It's that time once again, friends, where we ask you to fund the gay agenda. CJ decided to step up and help out this week. Thanks, CJ. CJ's money will go this week toward buying the 55-gallon drum of lube Celeste and I will undoubtedly need once our vaginas are healed enough to stick penises and penis-shaped things inside them. If you want to help out some queer chicks in their quest for the ultimate happy ending, head over to patreon.com/thegaytheist manifesto, where you'll find my entire unedited interview with Nate from the last segment. Thanks, friends. This past Saturday, I had the great honor of giving a talk at a con that holds a very, very special place in my heart. Gene asked me to speak at ReasonCon over a year ago, and I knew immediately that was where I wanted to propose to Celeste. So what you're about to hear is audio of my talk, followed by my proposal, followed by Shelley's performance for us of her song Gratitude. Of course, my presentation had slides, so there's a visual element, but I think it still translates well into an audio format, well enough to present here. So here is my talk from the stage at ReasonCon 3 from April 22nd, 2018. It is my love letter to science.
Love you, baby. Good morning. Man, this is awesome. ReasonCon is a really special place for me, and it's kind of a dream come true to be speaking here, so I'm really excited. I'll be honest, when Gene first asked me to talk here, I was actually kind of nervous, like, what am I going to talk about? Because if I'm known for anything at all, it is not being a science communicator, right? Because he wanted the talks to be science themed, right? Like, and I love science, but like, if there's a thing I'm generally known for, it's making Eli Bosnick cry. That's what I do. I'm a storyteller, right? So I try to tell the stories of the lives of queer and trans people and highlight the issues that we face and what we can all do to be better allies and in the context of atheism and fighting the religious right and so on. So I started thinking about what actually is my relationship to science. And I think a lot of times we end up thinking of science as just like the way we learn things about the world, right? We learn about evolution, we learn about space, we learn about curing diseases and that kind of stuff. And that's all important, but I also think that science can be a way that we learn about ourselves. Science can help us understand ourselves. When I first started this journey of coming out and transitioning, science was the first place that I looked to figure out what was going on and how to deal with the feelings that I was feeling. I wanted to make sure that I confronted whatever was going on in a way that was evidence-based. What did medical science have to say about the ways that people who have these feelings get comfortable in their bodies? What did mental health professionals think was the right way to deal with these feelings based on their expertise? I sought the answers to these questions using the best scientific knowledge available. And as an at least somewhat rational and logical person with an internet connection, that's not really a difficult thing to do. So today, I want to talk about how science helped me find myself and how science helped me find happiness, affirmation, and satisfaction with who I am as a person. This is basically my love letter to science. So I first sort of had an inkling of who I was around the age of 10. I was in 5th grade, and puberty's happening, and bodies are changing, and hormones are happening, and, like, that's a weird time in every person's life, right? Like, puberty is just fucking weird. Like, that's all there is to it. I actually think that puberty is a really good argument against intelligent design because you'd have to be either sadistic or incompetent to design that. But puberty's weird, right? And so as I heard my friends talking and I heard adults talking to me about the way that my body was changing and the way that my body was going to change, I realized that puberty wasn't weird for me in the same way that it was weird for everyone else. We had co-ed sex education classes, and I just remember thinking that, like, everything that they're talking about that happens to the boys is the wrong thing. I was looking at girls' bodies and the way they were changing, and I knew that was where I was supposed to be. That's what was supposed to be happening to me. I was actually in the car one day with a friend of mine, and his mom caught me staring at this girl that was walking down the street. And I got yelled at because my friend's mom thought I was, like, sexually objectifying this girl because boy and because testosterone and, like, you know, that's what happens at that age. But the reason I was really staring was because I wanted that body. I knew that's how my body was supposed to be, and I was fixated on it. But those sex education classes that I took made no mention of the fact that trans people existed. I never heard the word transgender until I was a teenager. And I never figured out that it applied to me until my late 20s. There were no cultural reference points to speak of, at least none that I was aware of at the time. All I knew was what happened to this kid in my class when he said out loud his favorite color was purple. And I knew what happened when boys cried. And I knew what happened when boys step out of those very rigid blue lines that are drawn for them before they're even born by the expectations of society and the expectations of their parents. So at that point, all I knew was that I was meant to be a girl, and that I also knew that it was very, very wrong to feel that way. And when you think there's no one else like you, when you see how harshly people are punished for stepping outside of gender roles, the only possible conclusion that I could draw was that there was something very, very wrong with me, and that I couldn't ever tell anyone how I felt. So fast forward to 28 years old. I'm depressed. And I don't just mean bummed out depressed. I mean difficult to function day to day depressed. I mean, maybe if I drove my car off this hill and died, no one would know it was on purpose, kind of depressed. And those feelings of knowing that I was supposed to be a woman never went away. They ate at me. At various points in my life, I was able to sort of push them aside and put them on the back burner, and sometimes even forget that they existed, but they were always there, ready to make themselves known at the absolute worst of times. And I finally came to the realization that these feelings were probably going to kill me if I didn't deal with them somehow. And I'm still pretty ignorant of trans stuff at this point in my life. I know trans people exist, but I still hadn't really made the connection that that was me, that I was trans. I thought, maybe this is just a fetish that I need to indulge in sometimes. Maybe I just need to cross-dress on the weekends. Maybe I need to be totally sexually submissive and be penetrated during sex. Maybe I'm just gay. Who knows? Totally gay, by the way. But basically, I made any excuse to not acknowledge who I knew deep down I really was. And since the age of 17 or 18, I'd consider myself a pretty rational and skeptical person, and especially so by my late 20s. And I'd spent tons of time reading books and listening to podcasts about scientific skepticism and following the evidence. I'd listened through the entire Atheist Experience catalog, Reasonable Doubt, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, like all of those shows. And I'd very much reasoned my way into a firmly atheist position by paying attention to the best arguments and the best evidence and listening to the best thinkers and presentations of the evidence from all sides of the theism question. And that seemed to work pretty well, so I thought I'd approach my identity struggles in a similar way. If I was going to confront these feelings and deal with them, I was going to do so in a way that was evidence-based, wherever that led. I was open to pretty much anything, although I was secretly still hoping that it would lead to a way out of me feeling that way at all. I was well aware what the consequences could be if this were truly who I was. So once I was finally comfortable enough to type the word transgender into a search engine, and that was a big barrier, I started looking for what the medical community had to say and what research had been done. There was a first-of-its-kind study done in 1995, and it was the first study to find that there could be biology at play in transgender identities. Slide clicker's like right at the edge of its range here. So this is a picture of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. I could be pronouncing that wrong. I'm not a doctor. It's fine. So this is a part of our brain that it regulates how we respond to stress, and it's also highly involved in sexuality. And the structure of this part of our brain is what we call sexually dimorphic. So it looks different in people who are assigned male at birth versus people who are assigned female at birth. And the structure is nearly twice as big in cisgender men as it is in cisgender women. So the first picture is a cisgender, by the way, not transgender. If you identify with what you're assigned at birth, that's what cisgender means. So the first one is a cisgender man. The second is a cis woman. And the third is a trans woman. So the study looked at the brains of trans women and cis women and compared them and figured out that the size and structure of this part of the brain were very similar between the two groups. Like, obviously not identical, but they're very similar. And the study also found that even though your brain structure changes when you're on hormones, this relationship did not change regardless of whether the person was on hormone therapy or not, or based on their sexual orientation. And there was another study in 2000, they repeated this study and got the same results. This was an amazing thing to find out. So I'd read a lot of things that told me that I was sick, that this was all in my head, that this was a mental disorder that I needed to be treated for, that I needed to be fixed. And my cultural programming told me the same thing. But here science was, at least in part, to tell me that no, there is actually evidence that points to this being a biological basis for how you feel. It may actually be an intrinsic part of who you are. I may not actually be broken. I may not need to be fixed. But of course, 2 studies don't make a firm conclusion. We know that very little in the study of human behavior and human development as certain, but this was an amazing place for me to start. And I just got curious, generally, what do medical professionals say about transgender people and gender identity in general? And so after looking around on the internet, I found a document that was put together by this group called Lambda Legal. And basically they're a group of legal professionals that help trans people with legal issues. And they put together this document that had the position statements of a bunch of different organizations of medical and mental health care providers. So this is the American Medical Association. I'm sorry if that font's too small to read in the back, but I'm going to read it anyway. So in 2008, the American Medical Association said, an established body of medical research demonstrates the effectiveness and medical necessity of mental health care, hormone therapy, and sex reassignment surgery as forms of therapeutic treatment for many people diagnosed with gender identity disorder. Therefore, be it resolved that the American Medical Association supports public and private health insurance coverage for the treatment of gender identity disorder. The American Psychiatric Association recognizes that appropriately evaluated transgender and gender variant individuals can benefit greatly from medical and surgical gender transition treatments, advocates for removal of barriers to care, and supports both public and private health insurance coverage for gender transition treatment, opposes categorical exclusions of coverage for such medically necessary treatment when prescribed by a physician. The American Psychological Association. The APA recognizes the efficacy, benefit, and medical necessity of gender transition treatments for appropriately evaluated individuals and calls upon public and private insurers to cover these medically necessary treatments. Now, I could probably spend the rest of this talk listing the names of the other organizations in this document, but I think by now you get the point. Whoop. Almost spoiled it. So there are 2 words that appear very often in this list of position statements that meant everything to me. And those 2 words are medically necessary. These are groups of physicians and mental health care providers calling the things that I felt I needed medically necessary. This wasn't just some weird thing that I wanted because there was something wrong with me. This was a thing I needed. So after learning all of this, I finally got bold enough to talk to an actual person in real life about this. I called a close friend and I confided my feelings in her. And I told her about the discomfort that I'd felt ever since I was young. I told her about these feelings of dysphoria, and I told her what I'd read about this transgender thing actually being a thing. And I wasn't yet 100% convinced that this described me, but it sounded right. So it was something that I had to explore. So a week or so later, she came to my house and she did me up. We went clothes shopping, she did my makeup, she did my hair, and I looked in the mirror, and I am not exaggerating when I say that I almost passed out. I don't know how to exactly describe this feeling without sounding like some new age hippie, but it really was like seeing myself for the first time. I connected with my reflection in the mirror for the first time. Things made sense. And it was the first time that I really had felt like my outsides at least somewhat matched my insides. And that was the day that I knew. This is a picture from that day. This was the day I figured it out. I knew this was who I was. And it was up to that point one of the happiest days of my life. And thank you. And then I got scared. I'd done enough reading to know the consequences that people face for coming out. I'd read the statistics. I'd read about people losing their families, their friends, their jobs, their financial stability, and I was terrified. It's fairly common knowledge that being trans puts one at higher risk for things like depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation and suicide. And of course, our opponents want us to think that that's because being trans isn't a real thing and that you're forcing yourself into this unnatural position in life and that it creates dissonance and that's what causes all these problems. So therefore, we could never be happy and will never be happy until we embrace who we were supposed to be. When I first started dealing with these feelings and I started coming out to friends and my family, and I noticed this sort of low-level stress that was always there. And it wasn't the hair raising on the back of your neck, you're in immediate danger kind of stress, but it was the kind of stress that comes with a heightened awareness of your surroundings and knowing that you're slightly less safe than you were before. Less safe socially if your friends and family decide not to support you. After coming out, less safe physically because simply existing in public has gotten trans people killed. And I experienced this and I described it to several people, including on some episodes of the show later on, before I realized that what I was describing was something that's actually been studied. It's called minority stress. So the minority stress model basically explains the relationship between minority status and increased risk for mental health issues. There's more to it than that, but that explanation suffices for the point that I'm trying to make. Even before fully coming out and beginning my transition, I'd started to feel the effects. So the evidence thus far tells me that I'm not sick and wrong because of how I feel. And it tells me that the stress I'm feeling is largely a result of the stigma that surrounds gender roles in our society, not the result of me deep down inside knowing that being trans is wrong. So I started therapy, I started hormones, I started going to support groups. We know that social support is a really strong barrier to these negative outcomes for minority groups of any kind, and it was for me too. Previous to transitioning, I was one of those people who always had a project, right? Throughout most of my life, that project was music. I also got big ideas like starting a record label, learning how to do computer programming. I was even dead set on being a personal trainer at one point. And I think we all know someone in life who is like I was, right? I'd find a project, it'd be an all-consuming obsession for some period of time, and then I'd completely forget that I even cared in the first place. So knowing this was the kind of person I was asked the question, is this another one of your projects? Are you struggling with these feelings and using this transition thing as your project to fix these feelings? Are you going to ask your friends to change their names and pronouns and 2 weeks later tell them never mind? You need to carefully consider this before you take steps and do things you can't reverse. Hormone therapy sterilizes those assigned male at birth in just a few months. Do you want biological kids? If you have surgery, you can't take it back. And on and on and on and on and on. And of course, what these questions really get at is whether or not your gender identity is an intrinsic piece of who you are as a human being. And I knew on the deepest level that this was who I was, but I also understood the kind of person that I was, so I just let them go, and I was content to they'll just figure it out after a certain period of time. So there's an interesting and tragic story, because it wouldn't be a Callie talk without a depressing story. There's an interesting and tragic story that sheds a really bright light on the question of whether or not our gender identity is an intrinsic piece of who we are. It's the whole nature versus nurture question, right? No, of course, even if we did concede that one could choose their own gender identity, that shouldn't change anything about the discourse, right? As if that being a choice would change the calculus on whether or not that person is deserving of respect. But there's a story that demonstrates, at least anecdotally, that this is probably not something that anyone actually chooses. This is David Reimer. David was born with a condition called phimosis. Phimosis is basically a condition where the foreskin of the penis can't be pulled back. And David underwent circumcision to correct the condition, and the doctor completely botched the operation, and David's penis was damaged beyond repair. His parents were obviously concerned what this was going to mean for his future health and sexual maturity and functionality, so they took him to see John Money. John Money was a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University. He had made a name for himself because of his work with intersex patients. He was famous for being a proponent of what's called the theory of gender neutrality. And the TLDR version is that he believed that gender identity was entirely socially constructed, and that with the appropriate behavioral interventions, that a child's gender identity could be changed. The Reimers saw him on 60 Minutes or something like that talking about this, and they thought, this is a guy that might be able to help us. So John Money convinced David's parents that he would be able to be more functional and would have a more normal sexual maturity if they were to perform sex reassignment surgery on him and raise him as a girl. And John Money thought that it would be a perfect test case because David had a twin brother. They shared a family environment, they shared genetics, they shared a prenatal environment. So his twin was a perfect control to prove John Money's theories about gender identity. So John Money forced David and his twin brother to rehearse sexual acts on one another, claiming that it was important for a healthy adult gender identity, whatever the hell that means. David's family started to realize that this was hurting and not helping. They stopped seeing John Money after he started pressuring them to finish the sex reassignment surgery that was started on David as a child. And David Reimer eventually went public with his story. He talked about how as a child he never identified as a girl, and how nothing, not the hormones he was given, the behavioral therapy, the clothes he was given, none of that made him feel any differently about who he was. He'd always identified as a man. By 13, he was experiencing suicidal depression, and he threatened to commit suicide if his parents took him to see John Money again. So they stopped. And David's parents eventually told him the truth about his past. And once he found that out, he transitioned physically to male. He started testosterone. He had a double mastectomy. He had sex reassignment surgery, adopted his male identity externally, married, and adopted 3 kids. David's demons never left him, though. He eventually committed suicide at the age of 38. Now, of course, this is an anecdote, right? One case is not science. This is one person's story. But I think it is a really powerful illustration of the thing that most every trans person knows and will tell you. Our identities are an intrinsic piece of who we are. And it also illustrates, of course, the awful price of getting it wrong and how trans people are treated by their families, their medical providers, and by society in general. What these bits of knowledge gave me was affirmation. And it can be hard to explain how important affirmation is if you're a person who doesn't regularly receive it from wider society. When you grow up and you see no one on TV, no one on the radio, no one in the media, no one in your social circles who looks, acts, or has the same experiences as you, that's a tough thing to deal with. You get the idea that there's something wrong with you. And as I went through not just reading the personal anecdotes of other trans people, but learning about the research that's been done, the brain studies I talked about, the statistical difference that social support makes in mental health outcomes, the fact that affirming mental health treatment works and conversion therapy kills people, the medicine involved. The first time a trans woman underwent hormone therapy that I could find out about was in 1949. I basically take the same kind and dose of hormones that a postmenopausal cisgender woman takes. And boom, puberty. But in the right direction this time. And medical science, through the use of hormone replacement therapy, has given me emotional stability. It's allowed me to form better and healthier relationships. I compare it to the difference between experiencing the world in DVD quality and experiencing the world in fucking 4K, ultra high def with Dolby Atmos surround sound. And I have boobs now, guys. Boobs are awesome. And I have them thanks to science. My facial hair used to cause me so much hurt. And my facial hair used to be so thick that it was literally impossible to shave it into invisibility. I tried all the YouTube makeup tutorials. I shaved my face raw. None of it worked. You know what did work? Fucking lasers. Science.
I burned that bullshit off my face with science. And last, but most certainly not least, my friends, in roughly 3 months' time, thanks to science, I am going to get a brand new, shiny science vagina. It is medical science that figured out how to take a penis, turn it inside out, and heal it up so I can stop being so fucking miserable about that part of my body. I can stop being reminded that I'm different every time I get undressed. I will never again be so miserable in my body that I would give a thought to harming myself to fix it. And of course, I'll be able to stick penises and penis-shaped things inside of it and have fun. And I'll actually be healed up just in time for PastaCon in October. So, Brian, when the heathen orgies are arranged, like, I'm in. Thank you. So we may not be able to point to the trans gene, right? We don't even know definitively, they're ideas, we don't even know definitively what causes trans people to be different than cis people. But I think given the science, given our experiences, given what we know about the health and happiness that trans people experience after attaining to transition to whatever degree they want it, we can say pretty definitively that siding with trans people is siding with the science. And these are the things I think of when I think of the science surrounding gender identity. And obviously, like, it's just interesting on an academic level, right? Like, human bodies and human behavior is just fucking weird. Like, it's really fascinating from an objective point of view. But I also think of the consequences of getting it wrong. I think about the lives that are being lost and the lives of those who are being denied their full potential because of the bullshit reasoning of Bronze Age philosophy. I think of my friends who have trouble getting even the most basic of medical treatments without getting a quiz about the arrangement of their genitals. And I look at myself. My life and my experience are largely an illustration of what happens when it goes right. I'm fortunate enough to have competent, well-informed, and compassionate medical providers in my life who've supported me through every step of my transition. I'm a happier, healthier, and better person thanks to their practical application of our scientific knowledge of gender identity. I'm a rare case. I shouldn't be. Things don't have to be the way they are, and science can help. Thank you. I actually have one more thing before I go. I'm pulling a Steve Jobs, and I have one more thing. So if I could get everyone, if you have a smartphone, do me a favor, get out your smartphone. Everybody, okay? And I want you to switch it to video and start recording video. Just trust me, you're going to understand what this is about in a second. I'll give you all a minute. Okay, I see the majority of the phones in the room up. Okay, good. So, anyone who's ever heard me talk about ReasonCon knows what a special place this is for me. God, I'm already crying. In a lot of ways, 2 years ago, this was the place where this amazing journey through podcasting and activism started for me. My first episode came out 2 months before the first ReasonCon I attended, but this was the first place that I felt like I was actually part of something. I was part of family. And I came here by myself, hardly knowing any of the people that I had met. And I was worried that people might be uncomfortable around me because I was trans. I was worried that me being trans would be the only thing people would want to talk to me about. I was also just scared of being in this state, in this area of the country, right? But when Gene gave the opening speech the first morning, he was unequivocal. This was a place for me. Not a place where I am merely tolerated or accepted, but a place where I'm loved and encouraged and affirmed and deeply, deeply cared for. I knew that I'd found a home, not just in this physical place, but in this community. And for someone like me, who just a year previous to that was scared to even say the word transgender, to find a home like this was an experience and a feeling I will never forget as long as I live. The relationships that I made that weekend 2 years ago and the relationships that I've made since then are almost my entire world. That very special journey that largely started here 2 years ago even led me to meet my girlfriend, Celeste. And if it's okay with y'all, I'd like to start another very special journey here today, in this place, among so many people I love and care for, and who have loved and cared for me. Hang on, I did a cute thing. You have made me happier and better and healthier, and I love you more than anything in the world. And I want to marry you. She said yes? Yeah. And now, the part where you all had your cell phones out, if you had video of this, send it to a North Carolina state lawmaker. Yeah!
Life can be hard, things can get rough. Stay on your guard and protect the good stuff. But sometimes we all feel that we've had enough. Don't wanna spend my short time feeling down, or go through my days getting used to a frown. So I will express my anger where credit is due, but it won't take away from my gratitude. There's nowhere to hide when you live in a cage. You feel young inside, but on the outside you age. And everyone lied when they told you there's the next stage. 'Cause one day my memories will all be gone. Not a single one of all who I love will go on. And I'm afraid of the end. Yeah, I don't want it all to, but it won't take away from my gratitude. When the world is on fire, down come the rains. Truth and desire help us overcome our pain. And when we take it higher, only mystery remains. And it's almost too good to be real. And it's hard to define the transcendence we feel. I don't believe in a great power to say thank you to, but it won't take away from my gratitude. And after the rain confusion runs deep, and it's hard to know what's right. Sometimes you can't sleep and you get lonely at night, but you decide what you keep. The morning brings a new light. I'd rather find out what's real than deny the truth. May be hard, but it's better than living a lie. So before disaster strikes and everything I've built comes unglued, I'll be reveling and dancing in my gratitude.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. Again, big shout out to Nate for sharing his story, and to all the folks involved with ReasonCon and all the folks that we love so much that shared the weekend with us. It was an amazing weekend, and we can't wait to do it again. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Gaytheist Callie, and you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. And, Ari's outro has to be as good as ReasonCon was. Go.
So you heard a lot today in this podcast episode about things that went on during ReasonCon proper, but the after party on Saturday was way more eventful. And for those of you who couldn't make it, I want to make sure that you don't miss out on what happened. So here's a laundry list of some stuff that happened. So first of all, Louis made out with both Morgans, Morgan Stringer and Morgan Clark, at once. So that was amazing. And then William, Katie, and Rachel climbed on top of the roof, and they declared an eternal prank war on the entire state of North Carolina. This is people were just, drunk and doing all sorts of crazy things. And then once that happened, things got really out of hand, and Tom was in a room with 5 NBs at once, and unfortunately, he actually suffered a massive worldview expansion, and he had to be hospitalized for 2 days. I think he's doing okay now. I heard from Cecil that he's been released. He's at home recuperating, but please keep him in your thoughts. Send him some messages. Another weird thing that happened was that the next morning, Alice, Andrew Torres, and Trav woke up on the inside of vending machines, and nobody knows how this happened. They just woke up and they were in there. I mean, not in the same vending machine, on different vending machines on different floors. It is yet to be explained. I'm sure Gene is looking into this to make sure that this incident doesn't happen again. And I also want to give a shout out to some people who wanted to make it but weren't able to. For example, Ishmael Brown, friend of the show from Angry Black Rant. Unfortunately, he got sick and wasn't able to make it to ReasonCon, but he was there in spirit. And if you were there, you know what I mean. If you want to know what that was about, or if you want to hear more about what happened at ReasonCon or anything, you can friend me on Facebook. You can email me at restillman4@gmail.com, or through your sheer force of will, acting upon an irrational and often inexplicable universe, you can dream up a time machine into existence to go back and not miss it, because that was a mistake.
Fair enough. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto and make a per episode donation to help us out. If that's not something you can do, you can't always head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. That helps us get heard by more people, which is always a good thing. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.